Hey everyone, welcome to another artwork analysis. Now this will be a very special edition because I want to analyze my own artwork. A lot of people have been asking me to really look into my own stuff and my processes. Now, I'm an advocate of explaining theory and my thought processes rather than showing how I move my hand on the monitor and such because everyone has their own pace, everyone has their own paintbrushes and stuff, but fundamentals are always consistent throughout any artist, no matter what style. So I want to really just talk about the way I thought about creating this piece and really look into as well how you would go about creating a comic. Now, this, of course, is based off the franchise League of Legends. The characters are basically established for you. So the important part in this particular case is to create a narrative within 3 panels, and that was the criteria. In a lot of cases, you'll find that clients will have parameters on what you are able to do. So it's very, very important to follow their rule set and really understand what you can explain within the parameters that you were given. So, number one, my point is to plan and to create roughs. Now, I didn't get the full roughs, but you can get an impression of what I'm going for. Now, I'll briefly talk about other points throughout talking about planning as well. So don't mind me if I go into the other topics, just jumping ahead type of thing. So right off the bat, I want to I have to talk about something that is teamwork related, and I wanted something different. Now it would be cool to have action scenes and such, but I want something more dramatic, almost over dramatic, because if you've seen this comic, it's very much inspired by Metal Gear, and Metal Gear comic can get really over dramatic, and I like that, and my style kind of caters to that. So one thing to note is that all 3 of these panels, number 1, number 2, and number 3, they all each have a different shot. Now, it would be very, very boring if I just had a floating head for all 3 of these. So, in 3 shots, I really want to make it the most interesting ways possible. So, I wanted the variance of shots, which is my point number 2. So number 1 is a medium shot, number 2 is a close up, and number 3 is a long shot. Now the story is kind of it is relevant as well, but just assume that I'm planning. I've been writing the script and such as well. I'm not going to show it here, but you want to have some sort of rough idea. You shouldn't start a comic without knowing exactly on text what you are looking to do in each panel and what you're trying to explain. So here, from even these roughs, you kind of get the sense that, hey, there's a character entering here, and now in the second panel, you see her close up. Now, one thing to note is that Lux, the character in this panel, is always on the right side. And that is a very deliberate thing because you might have heard the 180 rule in other videos and other tutorials where if you were to flip the orientation of your characters, so for example, if I put the character on the left side, the same character, in the next panel, then it will probably look a little bit confusing. So you really want to have a roadmap of where each character is situated. I'll even create a bigger space here, and I'll show you what I mean. So when you're planning for any sequential work, you really want to even a really quick sketch, understand where characters are, because it'll save you a lot of time trying to establish direction, and it'll make things more readable for your audience. So here we can see the character is entering here, and she'll probably stay a little bit closer to the door, actually, somewhere here. Use the same color here, so this is Lux. And Graves, the other character, the man, would probably be sitting around here, or even like right here, just to be a bit more accurate. Now, of course, for the sake of composition and for the sake of dramatic tension, you can always change these a little bit in between shots to make the best compositions possible. You don't have to be perfect in terms of your positioning, but make sure that they're oriented properly so you can create a nice shot. So, of course, I can always draw the camera as well to show you what I mean when it comes to creating a proper shot. Now, once you establish the positioning of these characters, now you have to really think about the colors and continuation. So what I mean by that is, okay, we know from the final. Actually, I'm gonna take a little bit detour here. By the time I release this comic, you can still vote for me on the official website for League of Legends. The link will be in the description. So you do not need a new account, or you don't need to register for anything. You just have to press vote, and I'll greatly appreciate it if you love my work, of course. Don't just randomly vote if you don't really like this. Make sure you vote for a good reason, and of course anybody else's work as well. So, anyways, now I want to go back into the coloring. Now, if you see the final, which again you could look from the link for a close up, you might have noticed that the colors have changed. So I started with a very gray, very grim mood on these areas. Now, I didn't really plan properly. So this is one of those things where you really, if I were to kind of redo this, I would have colored, or at least color keyed, all three of these panels at the same time in order to create something that works coherently. Because the third shot, spoilers alert, is where the character Yasuo is being surrounded by a bunch of monsters, Cho'Gath and all that, if you play League of Legends. So, I need to save darker colors for such a solemn and dangerous mood. Now, I didn't really anticipate that properly. So, I started with a very blue palette in the first panel. So this is a big no-no. This is one thing I would have redone. Make sure you color key all three panels to ensure that you're not overlapping any color palettes that might create a better mood. So in the place where Lux is meeting Graves in the first two panels, it's a lot softer in terms of mood than the third panel, so I shouldn't have used these colors. And you'll find that as I keep working around this area, I start changing to a warmer palette. And it works a lot better because story-wise, she probably traveled a lot, she went into a saloon, and westerns are kind of associated with warmer colors. So those things you kind of sometimes have to have trial and error. I will say you should plan it a lot better than I do, so learn from my mistakes. So now that I've established a warmer palette on the first two panels, it makes the third panel much easier to render. If we go to the finals here, again, you see the final, it makes a lot more sense. Now, one thing I want to note, which kind of is implied in a lot of sequential work, you probably would know this as well, but I want to reiterate it as well. You want to have different colors when you are swapping environments, and you want to make it very clear. So I didn't need another panel to say exactly where Yasuo is in panel 3, because of my color usage. Now, if I were to have the colors be overlapping with the first two panels, then it implies that they're all in the same environment, and that's not good in this particular case. So when you're planning for environments and your color palettes, understand that it's generally better to retain the same palette when they're situated in the same environment, and then swap it when you need to change into a different environment. So that's a continuation thing when it comes to colors. And it kind of overlaps into the positioning of the characters as well. So everything has to come together to be coherent. If you are confusing or you're making the directions all over the place, then the audience can no longer follow you. And especially for a simple comic like this with 3 panels, you're probably going to quickly disassociate your audience, and they wouldn't know what to think of it. So always play on the safer side when it comes to these sort of things. Make sure that again, your colors are consistent in the same environment, and make sure your directions are proper. Now, the third panel, you can see I didn't really have roughs for, but you kind of get the gist of it. The really sketchy part of it kind of gives you an impression of what the focal points are, and there wasn't really too much into the third panel. The hardest panels, trust me, were the first two. Number 2 was actually extremely hard, and that comes down to just rendering the face and making sure the expression is proper, but that's besides the point. So I want to really end off with one more concept when it comes to this particular comic. It's the idea of page movement. Now, obviously, we are making a comic, which means that it's a sequential, which means there's more than one illustration on any given page. That's pretty much implied. So we have to plan for page movement. Now, variance of shots actually helps to that. So when you're varying your shots, so again, it's the idea of mid-shot, close-up for number 2, and then long shot for number 3, is that your focal points are most likely changing alongside with it. So even from the rough, we know from here that the focal point would be something like this. It gets you through the entire canvas, the entire page, and it works properly. When you are planning for your comic, whether it's a portrait page or a landscape page, you have to make sure, similar to an illustration, similar to fine arts, similar to any type of art, that you incorporate your audience's eye movements to it. You want to make sure that they look through the entire page, and you don't want to isolate your focal points to be, for example, on the top of the page or on the bottom of the page. Now, you might have noticed, even from my early roughs, that I put down the titles. This is actually a deliberate thing I do. Even though the actual name of this comic changed, it is very important to plan ahead on even the text in the page, because those matter in terms of your eye movements. So the comic page is sort of like incorporating and treating text as part of the elements of the page. So it's so important to know exactly where your titles are, because they will also catch attention from your illustrations. So as you can see, again, the title change, it doesn't matter, the focal point is still there. You treat it like it's a pictorial element. So, of course, that also implies and leads into the idea of speech bubbles. Now, again, the speech and the dialogue changed. So it's one of those things where you don't really want to have your picture, you don't want to really force the dialogue and speech bubbles onto your pictures. You want to make sure your pictures are working properly, and there's always going to be space for you to have your dialogue in. So when I was making these pictures, I wasn't really thinking about where the text boxes are really, it's not a big deal because within the focal points, there's always space in between. And comics, you'll find that even if you take out the dialogue, the pictures always work because they always plan from a point where they cater their they cater the pictures with the speech bubbles. Basically, they prioritize the pictures first and then think about the speech bubbles after. Now, that is not always the case. Sometimes the dialogue is so important that, and they have to be all perfect on, and they have to be crammed within maybe one or two panels, that you do have to plan ahead with your speech bubbles. But in most cases, especially in the digital age, we have the option of moving things around. So I wasn't really too worried about it. So you notice that even when, if you notice the difference between the final and the roughs, you notice that I did change a lot of dialogue, but it doesn't matter because again, the pictures themselves work. So the speech bubbles on top of them, I could just place them in the negative spaces and it'll work just fine. Now going back to the idea of page movements as well, speech is a fantastic way, dialogue rather, to create the to kind of accentuate and really complement the pictorial movements of your pieces. So here you can see that I now not only go through the pictures, people now are looking through the entire canvas, the entire page, and the dialogue actually slows down the pacing to allow for the audience to really appreciate the pictures more. So again, dialogue, while it's very important, can always complement and can always be thought secondary, with some exceptions, obviously, especially when it comes to clients where your script cannot change too much. But other than that, understand that there's always going to be space for it. You don't really have to be really anal about every single bubble and making sure every word fits in. Those things, just worry about the nice illustrations first, and then just put in the speech bubbles in the negative spaces. So hopefully that gives you an idea of a little bit of an idea of what my thought processes are when it comes to this sort of thing. I don't really do comics too much, but the ideas and the art fundamentals of illustration are very similar. We still treat dialogue as if they're focal points, as if they're pictorial elements in the piece, and of course titles as well. And just make sure that your illustrations work with or without the speech bubbles. Every illustration fundamental, every art fundamental kind of still functions within the comic space. It's just sort of adding new elements and using them to your advantage and making sure that they do not take away from your work. Now, again, if you love this particular comic, make sure you look into the description. I will have a link for the voting process. You do not need to register for an account. All you have to do is press vote. Anyways, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.